to the cloud, John. Okay, everybody's comfortable with that Fuyu and Hachiya variety. All right. Let's go back to our presentation here. I apologize I didn't start it on time, but you do have the slides. I will make those available to your group. Once again, there's two main varieties. There's the Fuyu, which can be eaten when it's hard, and there's the Hachiya, which generally is eaten when it's soft or processed. And it's going to get a little bit confusing because we're now going to go down the rabbit hole on persimmon variations. There's the astringent ones, and these are those generally with a pointy base. They have high tannin levels, which is the same thing you get in some of your wines. And they give that fruit a furry or chalky, a very bitter taste. Those tannins are converted to sugars after a frost or freezing if you put them in a refrigerator, as it were. Dehydration, which is another favorite of mine. Exposure to light, which I found it was interesting. And some of them you can put in alcohol. The Hayakumi is one that they typically will put in alcohol, and that will also convert that. I've not tried that. I believe what you have to do is inject the alcohol into there, and I'll try that one of these days. And I've got to admit somebody here. There we go. And here's where it's going to start getting a little confusing. You've got pollination constant, always astringent, and those are referenced as the PCA. And those, once again, are going to be your Hachiya, your Virginiana, which is the Native American, a Tamopan, which will have some examples of that. That's a very unusually shaped one. Honan Red, which is one of my favorite. Seijo, which means sweet in Japanese. And not available in California. There's a couple varieties that I've been fortunate enough to sample. One called Russian Beauty and the other one called Nikita's Gift. All of those are always going to be astringent, even if they get pollinated. And if they get pollinated, they're typically going to have seeds in them. The pollination invariant are astringent when they're seedless, but not so if they get pollinated. Some of them are, one of them is referenced as coffee cake. You might be familiar with that. Hayakumi, another one called the chocolate. Now, this is not to be confused with the chocolate sapote, but it's known, I believe, in Japan as the stork egg. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the Japanese name. Then you have the pollination constant non-astringent, which means whether or not it gets pollinated, it's going to be non-astringent. These are the ones that you can eat when they're firm. And this is any of them that have Fuyu in the name. A lot of times you're going to hear the word OC Fuyu, True Fuyu, California Fuyu, LA Cook, and these are all variations of the same name. You also have Matsumoto Wasa, and Wasa is Japanese for dark, as dark flesh. The Gosho, the Jiro, and the Suruga, all those are ones that are going to be have less tannins, less astringency. And then the last one is the pollination variant, non-astringent. If it gets pollinated, and these are the ones that are always a little difficult to deal with, if it gets pollinated, and you won't be able to find out until you cut it open whether or not got pollinated, it has what's called a goma, and there'll be a dark area inside of the persimmon. And that dark area, and this is very strange, that dark area will be sweet, and the rest of it will still be astringent. And that's one of the goofball things. And if you don't have a way of dealing with it, you might as well wait until those are soft, because Otherwise, you're just going to a lot of times waste a lot of fruit. I've cut some of them open in the past, and you would have a good sized fruit, the size of a decent apple, as it were, and you might have a spot in there the size of a marble or a golf ball, and the rest of it is the astringent. Now, we have some ways of dealing with that, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. But there's a couple of varieties there that are mentioned, Kurokuma, Dai Maru, and the Tribble, that are that pollination variant non-astringent. So that's one of the toughest parts of dealing with the persimmons. This is probably also a good time to mention to you, and I'll show you at the end of the presentation, if I need to fill some time, hang on, I've got to admit somebody. I'll show you some of the documentation that we'll make available to you. A lot of this are information you already know about. You've got the fruit facts, which are available through the CRFG website. And you also have, I've got some things I downloaded from some reliable sources, including some problem-solving things, because as you know, when you're dealing with disease and pests and whatnot, that can be a little troublesome. So we'll make those available to you. Productions and uses. Production, according to stat in 2018, was set almost 8 million tons, and China accounts for 80% of this total, and other producers were Spain and South Korea. Persimmons can be stored at room temperature at about 68 degrees, where they'll continue to ripen. And I guess in northern China and other parts of the United States, unripe persimmons are frozen outside during the winter. You can just place them on a windowsill if you want to speed up that process. That is for the astringent varieties that have to go through that freezing process. The wood is used for a variety of different things. It's kind of a strange wood. It's considered a hardwood, but yet it cracks easily. And this is, I guess, somewhat difficult to deal with. But it could be used as paneling in some traditional Asian furniture. A lot of the fine-grained wood of the Virginiana is used to make billiard cues and the shuttles that are used for the textile industry. I guess they can also be used for making percussion pallets and drumsticks and whatnot. I always heard that a lot of times back in the day, before you had the metal heads to golf clubs, for what is known as the woods, that it was used for, this persimmon wood was used for the golf heads, the wooden golf heads. And in doing research, it appeared TaylorMade had a brand that was branded Pittsburgh Persimmons. And although persimmon wood is still used in those, its numbers is a whole lot less than what it used to be. I'm going to grab something to drink here real quick. A lot of craftsmen use this. I guess it's being used now for longbows. Archery's coming back in play. And it could also be used for wooden spoons. And I thought this was interesting, what's called cornbread knives, which is wooden. I'd not heard of that term before. Wooden knives that allow you to cut through cornbread without scarring the dish. I thought that was kind of an interesting application. And some of the persimmon wood, when it's younger, it's lighter colored. And as it ages, it goes to black or a dark color. So I thought that was interesting as well. Culinary uses, I'll take a wild guess that virtually all of you, hopefully, have had persimmons at some point in time. It is still confusing. I still run into a lot of people, especially when we have the open houses and the tasting events that Isabel helps coordinate. The number of people who actually haven't had persimmons. Eating them fresh, raw as it were, whether it's the fuyu variety that you can eat like an apple, or the hachia that you have to wait until they're soft. You also have a process where you can harvest them and hand dry them. And the process is called hoshigaki. I won't go into it in great detail here. I'll mention it a couple times, but I will furnish a 2-page detail sheet that will go into that. And that hoshigaki is really quite a treat, and it's eaten as a snack or dessert in many of the Asian cultures. And if you ever go to any of the Asian markets here I'm sure you have them in San Diego. I used to live in Orange County, and they were all over the place. A lot of times they'll have those hoshigaki there. It also can be used, the dried persimmon can be used to make a punch and a mature fermented fruit vinegar. I've not had that. Might be something to do one of these days. From what I understand, in Taiwan, they will put it in lime water, and that lime water will get rid of the bitterness, as it were, that tannin. And the fruit slightly gets hardened in the process. And it might be interesting to try that too, Isabel, if you're online now. Might be something fun to do. And it's known as either a crisp persimmon or a water persimmon. Another one of those ways to get rid of that astringency. Also, some of them will take the persimmon leaf and make a tea. Others will actually take, I read somewhere that, I thought I read somewhere, nope, maybe not. I thought somewhere the calyx, or the little crown on the top of that, was being used somewhere, but I don't see it right now. Obviously, it can be used for a variety of different fruits and desserts and dishes, along with the information that I'm going to send to John will be information showing some recipes, a project we did quite some time ago. Some of you that might have been coming to Screc many years ago, we were able to sell a calendar. We're no longer doing that, but those persimmon recipes are in there, and you guys will get that as well. There's also a Persimmon Festival. Matter of fact, I'll show you my shirt from one that we used to have in Anaheim. But there is an annual Persimmon Festival in Mitchell, Indiana, which is fairly close to the Kentucky border. I had to look that one up. Persimmon tree care. This is the Cliff Notes version of it. Persimmons grow well in a range of soils. Orange County is full of persimmon trees. In Irvine at SCREC, the South Coast Research Station, as I mentioned, we have approximately 53 or so varieties of them, and they were unfortunately neglected for quite a number of years until Isabel took it upon herself to take that over. And the trees are doing very well there. Always have more fruit than we know what to do with. But they do tolerate more clay than some fruit trees, but they do like yet a well-drained soil. So you want to make sure that if you have clay soil, the property I had in Westminster, the soil was one notch above modeling clay. And if you're planting it in that sort of soil, you want to make sure you plant it above the ground level so the roots don't drown, or put in a French drain or some way for that water to drain off a little bit lower than the plant. Pruning, I've got a very bad reputation, and Isabel will confirm that. I've got a bad reputation for being a heavy pruner. There's a reason for that, because usually by the time I get involved in it, the trees have been neglected for several years. I have a neighbor that come to find out that had a bunch of persimmon trees up their driveway. And when we first moved out here, and it's the trees were in really bad shape. They'd been neglected, and some people prune very lightly because they want to make sure there's fruit the following year. My rationale for pruning heavy is I want to make sure that the tree is going to produce fruit a couple of years down the road. And if you are pruning a tree that's been neglected, a good rule of thumb is to break it up in kind of thirds. Prune a third and a third and a third. That's generally a good rule of thumb, but you may get that reduced crop if you prune it too much. Once again, and I see this all the time, I even see it at the trees that we take care of because the growth can be pretty significant each year. Don't let the branches get so long that when they do get that, the last thing you want to do is to stake it. If you get a heavy load and the tree, that branch doesn't break that year, do not prop it up with a 2x4 with a notch in it. Go ahead and prune that one back and make sure it's going to get sturdy. I've got a friend that lives up in Modesto that has a persimmon tree that his father's been neglecting for quite a number of years, and about a third of the branches are propped up with 2x4s. So, but they're waiting until it's just bad, just terrible. Thinning, you want to make sure that you thin the fruit. Ideally, you want to thin it when the fruit is small. Don't wait until they're golf ball size. Ideally, if you want to thin it, you want to thin it when they're pea size, because by the time it's gotten to golf ball size, it's already put a lot of energy in getting that fruit. Plus, it's also harder to pick them out. A lot of times when we're picking out the larger, trying to thin them out, if too many on a cluster and you trying to pick out one or two, and all of a sudden the whole cluster falls off. So it's a whole lot easier to thin them off. And on the bottom of this page, you'll also see this was kind of a fun project. We tried to get the fruit and the blossoms in various stages, and you can see the one with the white flowers, and then that white flower turns to an in-brown on the blossom, and then all of a sudden you've got a fruit, and then you go from there. So that was a fun project, trying to find at any given point in time enough trees with enough blossoms in different stages to do that project. Best time to thin is at the flowering stage, and then a month later when you're thinning the small fruit. Feeding, first application usually June or July, or about a month after flowering. Second application September and October. Pests, once again, you're going to get a detail sheet, but mealybugs are typically a problem. Scale, I've seen those. To the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen any tree borers. Usually what I see is woodpecker holes in there, which may let the tree borers in. But of course, another thing that you want to do out here in California is make sure that your trees, until they've developed a canopy, it's okay to put some sort of sunscreen on there. And this would be in the nature of a latex, not an enamel, but a latex paint, usually diluted 1 part paint to 2 parts water, and coat the trunk, and that's going to help protect it. You also have some diseases, and once again, I'm not going to go into detail on all of those. We also, a lot of times, will see aphids on there, and some of your persimmons, especially what's called the giant fuyu, where the calyx is, where that green cap is on the top of the persimmon, that a lot of times is the fruit kind of gets a very heavy cavity there, and if water collects there, all of a sudden you're going to get aphids and sooty mold and a bunch of other things in there. Very typical of that particular fruit. The tree we have on the right side there, that's a decent sized tree. It's probably, once again, only about 10 or 12 feet tall, and you can see some of the branches on there would need to be pruned back, especially the one on the kind of about half the way up, sticking out off the right hand side at about 3 o'clock. If you get a big fruit load on that, that certainly will break. As we mentioned, it's typically a hard wood, but it is brittle, and that causes the branches to break a lot. Let's get now to the pretty pictures. This is known as the giant fuyu, and you can see that calyx there, that little cap on the top where the stem is. And that is where if you have a lot of moisture, you have a significant rain, and if that fruit is hanging in the wrong direction, you'll get a little bit of buildup of all sorts of flora and fauna in there. It's almost a little microcosm. But a lot of times these are seedless, and this is a popular variety. Everybody's prone to big. I'm more prone to flavor. Big doesn't always impress me, but these giant fuyu are particularly nice. You'll also find sometimes your persimmons can be what we call alternate bearing. This is another reason that you want to thin out the blossoms and thin out the fruit, because if it does get a very heavy load this year, you may find the following year you don't get so much of a load. And that's references alternate bearing. This is another variety, the fuyugaki, or the true fuyu. And a lot of these have kind of a round, yet kind of a squared or an angular shape to them. You might end up with a lot of seeds in these. And this one and the giant fuyu are all non-astringent. Once again, it does have that astringent, that does have that tannins to it. It does have the astringency, but it's not as much as you do have in the Hachiya variety. And this one ripens a little bit late. And a lot of these, I mean, we've harvested some persimmons from here when I can keep. Fortunately for me, I like the fuyu variety. My wife likes the Hachiya variety. So I don't have to worry about her taking my fuyu varieties, and sometimes we'll have them just sitting on the counter and they'll last quite a while. I've had them last for weeks, and some of them, I had access to one variety, and they lasted for about 3 months just sitting on the counter. This is the California fuyu. Now you're going to see some of these are I'm not convinced I would be able to describe the differences in the flavors with these. Most often I notice the difference with these are going to be the color. And it seems like the California fuyu is a little bit more on the red side, especially the skin. Once again, very flavorful. These typically are a little bit smaller than certainly the giant fuyu, but you can see this was a cluster of 4 of them, and they're just really quite nice. A lot of seeds though. Suruga, this is another one of those large fruits. Now you notice once again, this has that kind of, and I'm sure there's a technical term to it, I just don't know it off the top of my head, and I was going to put in a slide that dealt with some of the shapes, but I felt this is going to be enough here. But I think, Bob, can you help me on that one? They're kind of a squarish shape. It's round, yet it's square. And we see this on a couple of them. I want to say oblate, but I'm not sure that's right. But this one is another nice variety. This can get as large, if not larger, than the giant fuyu. The nice thing about this one is it's often has just a few seeds in it. And you can see in this one, it's just had 1 seed in it. And when it comes time to talking about dehydrating them, having a persimmon that only has a few seeds in it is going to be very helpful, and you'll find out more about that in a little bit. Tree is pretty free from alternate bearing, and this is one that's recommended for our warm Southern California climates. By the way, all of the varieties that you see here, with rare exception, are at the research stations, correct? And so if the question comes up, will they grow in California? Sure, because Irvine is substantially warmer than certainly the southern part of San Diego County, especially the San Diego area. And remind me, John, I've got a story on that that we'll talk about at the end about your weather down there. You got me in trouble one time. Another variety of the fuyu is a true fuyu. Oops, is that a repeat? Yep, I'm sorry about that. This is a slightly different slide. And this is a popular variety and evidently the most popular non-astringent variety in Japan. They also have the Jiro or the Hiro, whichever way you want to pronounce it. And this resembles the Fuyu, only it's generally a little bit larger. And you'll notice once again, this is this, I guess they call it truncated and squarish in the cross section. So it kind of has that squarish feeling about it. And this is part of how you're able to figure out some of the varieties of these, and most pronounced in the Honan red, which we'll be seeing here in just a few moments. Often sold as fuyu because just like a lot of times I see avocados that I know that are not Hass being sold as Hass, but these are often sold as fuyu. And we're going now to the astringent varieties. We have the Hachiya, and these are the ones which, when they're completely ripe, which is the picture on the lower left, this was a bunch that I had that I just washed very gingerly, and I was getting ready to pulp them. And a lot of times with your persimmons, it's feast or famine. All of a sudden, you're finding at the end of the season, and you've got all this fruit, and you can only make so many desserts and breads and puddings from that. And I find it very helpful to take these when they're in this super soft stage, and I'll cut the calyx off, make sure that I'm not incorporating any bugs in there, and just put them in a colander. And the advantage of the colander, it will help sort out the skin. A lot of times I'll just cut the calyx off and kind of hold the skin, turn it upside down and squeeze it, and the flesh will fall into the colander. And then you take a whisk and kind of beat it up a little bit. The flesh falls through the holes in the colander, and you have seeds and sometimes bits of the skin left over. Take and put it in a 1 gallon Ziploc bag. Don't fill it too full. But put a couple cups in there, lay it flat in the freezer. Take all the air out, lay it flat in the freezer, and then once it's frozen, you can stand it up vertical. And I typically mark it with the variety that I have, because sometimes I'll want a specific thing like the Honan red because it has a little bit of a cinnamon flavor. I'll mark the bag before I fill it. And that way you can get the one that you want. And that's a very easy way to have persimmon pulp available in other times of the year. These are typically one of your most prolific varieties, the Hachiya, the common Hachiya in that sense. And are various names of that, but very typical, very large, very pointy, look like a huge acorn. And some of them don't have a lot of seeds, but once again, we'll talk about dealing with that in just a moment. Emperor, I don't know too much about this particular one. I've had it, I like it. It's also one of those astringent varieties, but you can also dehydrate it or turn it into hoshigaki, and I believe this is one of the ones that we typically use for the hoshigaki. I've done that. Oops, I got somebody coming in. And this is a good variety for that, more on the hoshigaki in just a moment. Tamapan, this is one of my favorites. It's not very well known. It can be particularly large. Matter of fact, if we look at the photograph in the upper right, this shows a cluster of them on 2 branches. And these things can get huge. They can be the size of a softball. And when there's that many on a branch, that can be a little heavy. The photograph on the lower left, if you look at that, if you look at hopefully the photograph, you can see it on your end. I'm seeing it on my end here. The big one on the right-hand side is a different color. It's more of a lighter orange than the one on the left-hand side. So if you're looking at that one on the left-hand side, you should also see that one on the left-hand side kind of looks like it's sagging a little bit. Well, the reason it's doing that is making that transition to the non-astringent. It's starting to get ripened, it's starting to soften up. And this one, just like the Hachia, when it's ripe, and if you get bonked on the head with it or on the shoulder, a lot of times when we're in there, we wear hats not to protect our head from the branches, but to protect our head from a overripe persimmon. And some of them, when they get overripe, they start getting really nasty. Hayakumi is one of those where it's just awful. But this is another one of those visual things. It's not only the texture when you feel it, but it's visually, you will see this starting to ripen. It starts changing from a light orange to a dark orange. This is a Washa Jisha, and I believe this is a astringent variety. This is the one which we find is very prolific year after year after year. And this is the one where we typically, if we do get broken branches, this is the one where they're going to break. And you can just imagine the fruit load on this. It's not one that's particularly popular, but it's one of those ones where if you want to make desserts from it or breads from it or whatnot, this is a good one to do that with. Honan Red, of the astringent varieties, this is another one of my favorites. This is not particularly large. These are going to be about a little bit larger than a baseball. And the beauty of these, when they do get ripe, they turn this brilliant red color, and you can see the shape on these. They're very pronounced ribs on this one. And when you're in the field, when people are first starting to learn about them, this is an easy one to spot, an easy one to say, oh yeah, this is how you tell this is different from the other ones. And unfortunately, this sits right next to one of the non-astringent variety of the Fuyus. And sometimes people will grab this one thinking it's the Fuyu variety, and they're surprised when they bite into it. This typically also bears a good crop. If I'm going to use this one, I try to get them, and by the way, they will continue to ripen once they're off the tree. So if it looks like it's starting to change to that nice red color, you just have to watch it carefully. And it's not quite as bad as cherimoyas. For those of us that have been out in cherimoya fields, you know that cherimoyas can go from brick hard to ripe to overripe to fermenting in about 4 days. These aren't that bad, but you do have to start watching them. These will also get very messy if they get overripe. So just keep an eye on that. And this is a nice, tall and upright tree, and it's very good for fresh eating. And my taste buds are often suspect. My father-in-law thinks my taste in wine is atrocious, but I seem to taste a little bit of cinnamon in this particular variety. And I don't know whether that's psychosomatic or what, but it always seems to have a little bit of a kind of that tart cinnamony flavor to them. Not sure what's next here. Oh, unusual persimmons and other phenomena that you might find in the tree. Let's approach the middle one. This is the infamous persimmon thief pig, and she's only seen at the orchard in harvest time. And if she's feeding, don't bother her because she's very dangerous. This is my lovely wife supporting her, support the persimmon shirt and with other persimmon regalia on. And she goes crazy at persimmon. She hasn't been able to figure out why she can't have persimmons on tap year round. The fact that she's not out there pruning them and working with harvesting them and whatnot, that's a different story. The other varieties on there, we spoke about the Texas persimmon up in the upper right-hand corner, and that is one that it's not the acorn shape that the lotus is, and the lotus is also another one of those where the seeds are good for rootstock. But this Texas persimmon is very similar to the lotus, and it gets very dark. They say black. I call it dark, dark, dark brown, but they reference it as black. And this is another one of those you have to eat when they're very soft. And it has a date-like flavor to it, almost a little bit of a fig-like flavor as well. The one just below it is one that we've grown from a seed, which makes it a seedling. And this is one of those where I was going to graft to it. And as things sometimes happen, you forget about it. And all of a sudden, it's a big tree. And it's like, oh, darn, we forgot to do that. And then all of a sudden, you tried the fruit. And it's like, wow, this is really kind of nice. So it's still a work in progress. It's the fruit's not terribly large, but you can see it has a very distinctive acorn shape. And this is another one of my favorites. It has a slight taste of pumpkin or squash about it. And this is one of those ones where if it gets overripe, I personally find a significant change in the flavor, and I don't like them when they're overripe. I like them when they're just starting to soften up. The one in the upper left, I couldn't remember the name of it. It's a number. It doesn't even have a name. And this is another one that's at the research station. And this one stays green, even when it's ripe. And this is very different. Both the leaves and to a certain degree, the persimmon have these little hairs on them. And by the end of the season, these hairs start collecting all sorts of things. And it ends up getting all sorts of creatures and flora and fauna growing on them. It's been suggested that this was a persimmon where they distilled an oil from it, and this was used to waterproof the Japanese paper umbrellas. And I got that information from a reliable source, but I have not over the years been able to confirm that or substantiate that because every time I try to research it, oil to waterproof Japanese umbrellas, I end up getting shellac and a bunch of other things. But those are some of the uncommon ones that you might see out there in a field or an orchard. Let's talk a little bit about dehydration. And this is something that I just love to do every year. We have for those of us that were in the restaurant industry, you would recognize this implement of tomato destruction on the left-hand side. This is what you use to slice your tomatoes. And when I started doing dehydrated persimmons, I don't know about you guys, but there's no way that you can evenly slice a hard persimmon. And I got to thinking one day and I thought, oh, let's go back to the days of the restaurant business in the late 70s, early 80s. And I bought one of the 1/4 inch tomato slicers, and it has to be a firm persimmon. Trust me, if it's starting to soften, it's not going to work on this. And how you use this, and these are reasonably priced. I think I got mine for 60 or 80 bucks, and it's lasted now for about 8 years. And the first thing you have to do is either make sure the persimmon has no seeds in it. And you find this out, the easy way to find it out is just cut the persimmon horizontally around the equator or the center. If it doesn't have seeds, you're in business. If it does have seeds, you pick the seeds out. And in some cases, if it has too many seeds, it's forget it. Go on to another one. If it's got too many seeds, hopefully that is a fuyu variety, and you can just go ahead and put in a pile to eat or to use like you would a carrot to make persimmon bread with it. The next photograph shows you those slices, and you can see how easily and perfectly it slices those. The whole idea with dehydration, at least in my imperfect view of the world, is that you want to have the slices even and the sizes even so that they dehydrate fairly evenly for the same amount of time. The picture to the right shows how some of the larger ones I will cut in half so they're about the same size. You put it on the dehydrator tray, and I believe on the setting recommended by the manufacturer, it was about a 6-hour turnaround time, and that's for 6 of the trays in there. And you end up with these dehydrated persimmons. They will reduce size by about 50%. And even the astringent varieties will be just as sweet as sugar. And that's Hayakumi that is over on the right-hand side. It shows you the interior of that, and you can see the dehydrated persimmon. And I've scored extra brownie points with my mother-in-law because she likes to have the dehydrated persimmons. So it's an easy Christmas present for her to give her a gallon jug of them. Now, there's one thing you have to be careful of, and that is if you try to slice, and it happens every once in a while, you just got to be careful. If you do try to slice the persimmons with the seeds in there, you probably aren't going to permanently damage the blades of the slicer, but you will bend them, and all of a sudden you go, hey, this thing's not slicing very easily. And then you'll go, duh, it probably has a seed in it. I forgot to slice it. And the other thing is to make sure when you've got the trays that you have, make sure that they are absolutely cleaned thoroughly and absolutely dried between batches. If you don't do that, there's going to be a certain amount of residual dried persimmons on your screen. And when you put the new ones on there, they'll have a tendency of sticking more on the screen. So what I found over the years, and this is something that is kind of a pain in the neck, and if you're doing a lot of them, buy a second dehydrator. I make sure I use the little blue scrubby pad, and I'll gently scrub off. In some cases, I have to soak the screens a little bit, get all that dehydrated, little bits of dehydrated persimmon off of there, air dry it, wipe it down, and then typically I'll stick it back in the dehydrator for about a half an hour to dry them before I put the next batch in. Otherwise, it's just awful to try to get them to unstick. Another way to kind of get them easily off is just to take a Teflon spatula and gently scoop underneath the dehydrated persimmons on the tray. Just be careful you don't dig in too deep, because a lot of those dehydrators have a plastic component, and it's very easy to poke through those. So just be careful. The next way of dealing with those is the hoshigaki. That's on the bottom of this page. And they are, once again, they're sold as a delicacy. And in Japan, they will hang them under the eaves. The biggest problem you're going to have out here is you want to put it in some sort of a screened device during this dehydration process that will help keep the fruit flies and the flies off of them. But it's very, very easy to do. You just take a Hachia type persimmon. You make sure it has, you have to figure this out before you start it. Make sure it has something of a stem left to it. Matter of fact, if the stem to it has a T shape, you're really going to be excited about this. You peel it, you leave the stem in, you peel the side with a potato peeler, and then you attach it to a string and you hang it up on a rack, and you have to massage it regularly, which means about 3 times a day. And that massaging process will convert that astringency to sugars, and you will start seeing sugar form on the outside of it as you're massaging it. And when they do this from a commercial standpoint, you can see on the right-hand side, they kind of flatten it out like a pancake. And a lot of times they'll put it either in a granulated or a powdered sugar during that process, and then they stack them and store them and sell them. You will have a sheet that will go into this in a whole lot greater detail. It's a 2-sided sheet, so have fun with that if you ever get around to doing that. Additional information and sources. Isabel, are you still on there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, well, I'm a firm believer it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. Isabel doesn't like her photograph taken, but she's instrumental to trying to educate me on persimmons. And that's Isabel in the middle photograph there at the bottom. And for those of you who know Isabel, she's like 5 foot nothing. And we always introduce ourselves as identical twins. And that shows on the left-hand side shows me with my lovely bride, and Isabel's husband, who's no longer with us, who also a big persimmon fan. And just to remind everybody, for those of us that can remember the original Wonderful Life in black and white, that's kind of a tribute to that movie and the old black and white movies and persimmons. You've got a lot of sources here. For those of you who have not been to SCREC, you're missing a great opportunity. They have educational events on there. Just go to their website or contact Tammy. There's her email address in the second heading there. And the events that they have in the fruit tasting, and this is very, very generally speaking, in January or February, kind of, sort of, is Cherimoya, depending upon how the season's going. In September is their open house there, if you've not been there, where you get to experience. They have a lot of vendors come there. They show they have houses set up where they have different landscaping methodologies, normal California water wasting, moderate water, and maximum water conservancy. In August or thereabouts is the pitaya or dragon fruit tasting event, which is they have a small fee associated with that, which in my opinion is well worth the money. Ramiro is very good about keeping everybody fed with a continental breakfast, and he usually springs for lunch. And as part of that small fee, and as I recall, it was $80 or $40 last time, you get to not only try the dragon fruit, but he allows you to select 3 cuttings, one each of the ones that you liked. They're called blades. And generally speaking, by the time everybody's round robined and picked up their 3 blades, there's usually a lot more left over, and he's very generous about letting people going in and getting more of those. But it's a good way to start a collection. November is generally persimmon time. And for any of these events, contact Tammy, tell her you want to get on the mailing list. She's got a DL that's huge, I'm sure. How all this is going to be affected by COVID-19, I have no idea. There is no direct access to the South Coast station right now. Nobody's allowed to go on there other than the 1 or 2 people who are in charge of keeping everything running there. I do not know what the people who are in charge of the various plots are doing. My guess is they have to get special permission to go on there, but there is no public access at this particular point in time. Everything is locked up. But keep an eye out for when this might be changing. And I'm hoping things will lighten up by September and we can get back on track. And for those of you who have attended the events in the past, we have anywhere from 8 to 20 different varieties of things that you're able to taste at these events. And it's always a good idea to try something before you go out and buy a tree. I forgot to get rid of, I'm also talking to John about doing a citrus thing, and I was building a speaker for that, so ignored that thing that says Journal Citrus Photos, but definitely go to the Department of Food and Ag for health and pest. For those of you who do not know about the UC Davis Integrated Pest Management, or IPM website, there is more information than you are ever going to need that talks about garden management, fruit tree selection, ornamental tree selection, pest control, just lots of things that you as the taxpayer are already paying for. You should be aware of your California your CRFG website and your related fruit facts on that. Last count, I think there's something like 40 different fruit facts on there, including the persimmon. I've taken the liberty of downloading that for you, and I'll get that to John that he can forward to you. Dave Wilson Nursery and the work done with Tom Spellman. I'm fortunate enough to have been able to work with Tom, another just encyclopedia of knowledge, just like Isabel. And Tom is currently working with that high chill apple trial. And of course, a plug for the UC Master Gardener program. My guess is you have at least one. I don't know, does anybody know down in San Diego? I know you have at least one, but when I did research, there was a bunch of little dots down there, so you might have more than one group. And that's not to confuse. The University of California Cooperative Extension differs from the Master Gardener group of Orange County, which is a whole different group. And I'm not going to get involved in the politics on that one. Thank you. We're going to open up to some questions here. This is a photograph of me with my monster camera. I'm one of those goofballs that's still out there photographing with an 8x10. I can't lug around my 12x20 anymore, but this is me out in Death Valley, and I appreciate y'all's time. And this is, once again, this is one of those Honan Reds. I'll kind of close with that, and I'll stop sharing, and it looks like there might be a question or two. Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, looks like we got some questions. Where can you get persimmon variety other than the usual science exchanges, which are limited? Yeah. I don't know off the top of my head. And Isabel, if you can hear me, unmute yourself, and you might be willing to chirp in. I do not know of, unlike the citrus collection, which is out in Riverside where you can order scion wood, I do not know whether or not you can do the same thing from the UC Davis collection. So that's something we can possibly check into. I know the Orange County group used to have a fairly robust scion exchange that I was involved with, and because I'm personally not involved in that group, I can't speak to how robust the persimmon collection is there. I'm trying to be political here, so bear with me. Other than that, you have to rely on somebody buying a tree, and more importantly, where are you going to get the rootstock? Now, there are some sources for rootstock. I do know your group is actively pursuing some rootstock. It just takes too long to grow things from seed. But if you're motivated and if you can get some of the Virginiana or you can get some of the Lotus, that would be the way to start that. Some of these varieties may not be readily available, like the Russian Beauty and the Honan Red, which you're going to see in your recipe sheet. Those are not readily available in California. And beyond that, I do not know of a Scion collection. Isabel hasn't chirped in there.
Okay, you want me?
Yeah. Do you know at UC Davis, does their Persimmon collection, do they offer Scions there for a fee?
Yes, wood skill. Yeah, you have to.
Oh, wolf skill. Okay.
They are getting some of our variety in there.
Okay. I'll check into that with Isabel and make sure, John, you get that information. I do know.
Also being a good friend of mine.
Well, yeah. Yeah. Well, see, I wasn't going to go there, Isabel. But yeah, yeah, how do I say this? We all have our connections in the world, and having the people that are in the right place at the right time, and making sure those connections. I know Bob gets up there occasionally, and I know Bob, pretty well for people who never meet outside of the Cherimoya field, but he's always up for the events. And I don't know, when do you guys have your Scion exchange, Bob or John?
Yeah, we try to do it every monthly now. So we start in January for the stone fruit and stuff to storm it, but we're trying to do it every month. Something.
Well, Scion, some things you can get almost year round, but you want to generally collect Scion when you're pruning it, which is usually in January or February when we're doing it at the research station, and you want to get it before there's any buds on there. So some things like figs and dragon fruit, grapes, mulberries, those you can just take a cutting and stick it in the dirt, and hopefully it'll put out roots. But persimmons aren't like that. So your first task is to try to get rootstock, and then worry about how you're going to try to get the Scion. But we'll check into the Wolfskill and find out. I do know the citrus collection in Riverside, it's very reasonable. They reference it as budwood, which basically means you get a stick of about 4 to 6 buds, and you are to do a bud grafting if you want to maximize your return on that. Otherwise, you're just grafting, 2 or 3 buds to only a couple of your rootstock. But rootstock is something that you have to plan in advance. And John, you and I have spoken a little bit about some sources. I know the Orange County group had some real challenges in getting rootstock for their stone fruit and for their apples. And I've already given John some information for a place I got rootstock from that I thought was fantastic. It was about 18 to 24 inches long. It was healthy. It was well packed. It was very vigorous. It was just perfect. And you guys can go from there. Growing it, if you're growing rootstock from persimmons, plan on at least 2 years. And one of the things that you might need to do, I don't know whether you're familiar with the term scarification. The shell of the seed for persimmons is pretty hard. And I like to just take it and put it between a couple sheets of sandpaper and just move it around a little bit. And that typically has enough scarification. It scars that seed enough so that it breaks it. Typically what happens in the wild is it freezes. So that helps with that scarification. But how often do we have freeze out here in California? We once had on New Year's Eve about a 4-inch freak snowstorm out here, and it was wild seeing all these trees that had never had a snow load on them, and all the branches were breaking. Let me see if I, yes.
I mentioned to them the root stock is always lotus. Root stock that they can get is always lotus.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Isabel reminded me, and we spoke about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about the lotus. The rootstock that you typically get is from the lotus. And that is the small one that's about the size of an acorn. It looks like an acorn, and it's about the size of a big one's an inch. Actually, a big one's 3/4 of an inch. Usually they're about a 1/2 inch size. And it's amazing how many seeds you can pack in one of those little guys. So if that's something you're interested in, John, keep in contact with me, and maybe depending upon how things open up, we might, but plan on 2 years. It just isn't going to get very big that first year. So can astringent varieties be grafted onto non-astringent? What's your thought on the Izu variety? Can astringent variety, I'm just looking at the chat here right now. Can astringent varieties be grafted onto non-astringent? Sure. I personally haven't tried. Well, actually, I have tried, but it didn't take. I personally haven't tried multiple grafted varieties on a single rootstock, but in theory, it would work. I know sometimes there might be some conflict. Isabel, you can chirp in if you want. It seems like there's one variety that doesn't graft well, and I just can't remember what it was. But generally, you don't want to graft multiple varieties.
It's the suruga.
It's the what, I'm sorry?
Suruga. The suruga.
Oh, Sharuga. Yes, you're right. Does that have to be grafted onto Kaki or Lotus?
No, it has to be in Kaki.
Okay, so the Saruga, which is one of the varieties we talked about, that's Suruga, I believe. That has to be grafted to your generic Kaki, not the Lotus. And that would be any of your Fuyu varieties. Those would be fine. So, but the other varieties you would want to graft to a Lotus or a Lotus-like. One of my projects out here, I do have one of the Texas varieties, the Texas Persimmon, the little one that looks like a Lotus, only it's a different shape and a slightly different flavor. And I've been remiss. Every year I go, okay, I'm going to save some of these seeds, and every year I forget to plant them. And but one of these days I'll get around to that. But if you can find already established rootstock, even if it costs you a couple bucks, and you know, at this stage, a lot of times it's worth just spending the money for that. Izu variety, Isabel, I think we have an Izu, IZU variety in
Yes.
at South Coast.
Yes.
I don't recall particularly about that one. Is that an astringent or non-astringent?
Yes, it's a little bit astringent.
Okay.
Until it's very dry, but that what is important about that is the first persimmon of the season.
Oh, okay, I see.
Early. That's the earliest one.
It's the early one of the season. Okay. I'll have to, you know what, I've sampled every one of them down there more than once, but it's one of those things where you just forget over time which ones were the best. I know which ones are my favorites, and I guard those trees very carefully. But the Izu, yeah, thank you for reminding me. That's one of the earliest varieties that are there, and it is, I believe she said it was an astringent variety.
No,
I guess
non-astringent.
it's a non-astringent. I
But
stand
yes,
corrected.
until they are very dry, when they are really dry, they are non-astringent. It's
So
still,
it
it's
is,
still fuyu. It's a fuyu, but if you eat it too early, they have a little bit.
so it's a fuyu variety, but if you eat it too early, it has a little bit of more of astringency than normal. So you have to wait until it's ripe, but not until it's soft. Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to have to try that one now. Somebody says, other than growing a Texas persimmon from seed, which takes a long time, how can you buy a Texas persimmon? Can't be. If it can't be shipped to California, it can't be shipped to California. You're done. That is from Alan. Yeah. I know of no. I only have one tree, so I'm guarding it with my life, as it were. But if you can't be shipped to California, frankly, because my tree is about 7 or 8 years old now. Unless you have, Alan, unless you have a particular reason why you want that one, I wouldn't bother. I would get one of the lotus ones and go from there. If you're looking for seeds, go with the lotus. The fruit, the Texas persimmon, it's small. It's not particularly flavorful. Unlike some of the others, the skin is a little bit tougher. I typically don't eat the skin. I just eat the small amount of flesh that's in there. And when it's got 6 seeds in it, there's not a whole lot of flesh in there, and it's not particularly remarkable. I wouldn't mess with it unless you have some burning desire. Robin says the Izu does well in La Mesa. Okay, thank you. And whoever O is, evidently he's got access to seeds if you want that. And I know of no issue with seeds, but don't quote me on that. I know the tree can't be brought in, but I know the seeds can. And you might find that particular that one, just like the lotus, it seems like that bears true to the fruit, unlike everything else. If you've got a fuyu and you plant it, you're not going to get necessarily a fuyu. The one that I showed you earlier that was an accidental seedling, that was that 1 in a million shot where the fruit's actually halfway decent.
This is Dave Sohn. Can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead, Dave.
Okay. I have a black sapota, chocolate pudding fruit, that's in its first year of fruiting, and I would like to graft a fuyu onto it, being that it is, the chocolate pudding fruit is a persimmon variety. Would I possibly be successful in doing that?
Yes and no. I would not, I would try one as an experiment first. Has it branched out at all?
I'm sorry?
Are you getting any branches, Dave?
Yes, I am getting some branching.
Perfect.
And this is the very first year it's fruited. It's been in the ground about 4 or 5 years now.
Okay.
And it's right next to 2 white sapotas, which I know are not related other than by name.
Right.
But it's the first year it's started to fruit, and I can see about 5 fruit on it right now.
Well, what I would do is I would just find one branch that you could experiment on.
Mm-hmm.
And that way, you can try it and see if it takes. If it takes, great. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Fortunately, my wife, she's up at 4 o'clock in the morning taking care of the animals. But if she knew that you had white sapote in your backyard, I would be expecting a visitor at white sapote season. She loves that. I think more than persimmons, which she loves dearly. So, but yeah, give it a shot. Eventual goal is, especially if you're limited by space, is to have different varieties. But I would not decide you're going to just cut it off at that and make a stump out of it and try to do a bark graft on it because you don't like it. I would just try it once and see if it takes. And then if that takes, you want to try another one, then try it again. But yeah, give it a shot. And then let us know what happens.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? Sorry, but what do you not want to use coffee seed? You can use it. It's just better with the lotus. The rootstock the question is why you do not want to use kaki seedling for rootstock. You can as a science experiment, but generally it's better to go with the lotus or the Virginiana, just because it seems to be hardier. I mean, once again, you can try it. The one that you don't want to do it on is lotus, is the Saruga, as Isabel pointed out. I knew there was one that was a problem. Anything else?
So Greg,
Okay,
Isabella said we could get Scion from the station?
No, she didn't say that.
No? Okay.
She said it depends on who you know.
Yeah.
We've got to, yeah. Okay, we got to be political.
Okay.
So if she's the boss out there, and she bosses me around all the time, but and I say that lovingly, but that's not for me to decide. That's a decision on her part. Okay. So we have to be real careful what leaves there and how it leaves and who's coordinating that. I do know that your group has come up and collected Cherimoya signwood in the past. But if I can jump out there and Bob, don't beat me up on this. Some of us have put in a tremendous amount of time, and Bob, I'm going to put you in that category at the research station, but it's a little bit disconcerting for those of us that are there year in and year out for groups, and I'm not saying it's a San Diego group, but for groups to come in when it's Scion Collection Day and it's also pruning day, and we see more Scion collection than pruning, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So it's because the work, especially in the Cherimoya, and Bob, you can chirp in too if you want. Those trees have been really neglected. We've been begging to have them come in with chainsaws and do rejuvenation pruning. They will not allow us to go in with chainsaws from a liability standpoint, which I understand. And but it's manual work. It's a lot of work trying to use a bow saw or a pruning saw to cut down a bunch of branches that are 8, 10, 12 inches in diameter. And some of those trees are so overgrown. But I'll get off my soapbox. It's just disconcerting when groups don't necessarily, and I put the Orange County group in this group, by the way, because at their Scion exchange, it's like a feeding frenzy. And I used to personally make sure that they had a variety of different apple, grape, occasionally persimmon Scion wood there. And it hasn't been explained to me where all those thousands of sticks go, because some of the groups they don't order the rootstock. And if you don't have rootstock, where are you going to put them to? So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. So by the way, I want to show off my shirt, my Support the Persimmon shirt. That was, I wore that for the occasion tonight. Is there any, Mark, Persimmon SDS is an issue? I have a couple of wounded, I'm sorry, okay. I don't know what SDS is. Ollie, Mark was answering that. I don't know who Mark is. The other one from Mark is I had a couple young persimmon trees died. Are the young trees prone to dying? I don't know. They're more prone than any other fruit tree. I've seen a lot of bad mistakes. If a tree gets, and by the way, persimmons and avocados, don't put them in a pot. You got to get them in the ground. I mean, you can put blueberries in a pot. And when I say a pot, I don't mean a 5 or a number 15. I mean a bigger one than that. If you've got a kumquat tree and you put it in a number 35 or a number 50, no problem. But any full-size tree, and you need to dissuade yourself away from the concept of dwarf trees. Remember, dwarf trees on a dwarf rootstock doesn't mean it's not going to get big. That just means it's not going to get 40 feet tall. It's only going to get 20 or 25 feet tall. So remember, you are in charge of pruning your tree. If you are able to come, if SCREC opens up again in September for their open house, I would encourage all of you, or as many as possible, and carpool or whatever, come up to the open house and see how the trees have been managed there. Isabel has been working tirelessly for over a decade, because I've been there over a decade, and she's been working tirelessly to get the citrus collection under control, the cherimoya collection, the persimmon collection under control. Those are the 3 main emphasis for what she's done over the years. She's also generously taken on the home orchard plot, which is once again the cream of the crop, and trying to maintain that. And in a lot of those open houses, they do have pruning type demonstrations where you can learn how to properly prune any of your fruit trees. Getting back to the question, are young trees prone to dying? No, if they're handled properly. Trees die. There's no getting around it. But if you have clay soil, you need to put in some sort of a French drain system. And John, remind me to get that to you. I've got a diagram that shows you how to do that. But what I find is a lot of people don't prune their trees back significantly enough when they get them as bare root. Or if they do get them in containers, they don't do due diligence in planting. And if that's something we need to set up on a separate entity, John, we can do that, because grafting and planting and that sort of stuff, that's going to be, an hour and a half of that. The thing that I can possibly just mention to you about transplanting your tree or planting it if it's bare rootstock or bare root, I'm sorry, bare a rootstock, sorry, bare root, is to when you make the hole, make it 3 times as big, but don't make it any deeper than that is. What happens a lot of times, and I've seen this over the years, Isabel and I have gone out on a lot of places together where we're doing damage control, and if you dig your hole and you dig it 3 times as wide and 3 times as deep, and you put a bunch of amendments in there, when you plant the tree, it's going to sink in, and that might now be the lowest part of your lawn, and you want that pretty grass growing around it to be nice and green, so you water it, and all that water is going to go into that hole. And if you have clay soil, your tree is going to last probably no more than 3 to 5 years. We hear this all the time. Tree was growing great for the first 3 years, and then it just rolled over. Well, it rolled over because you drowned it. So I like, I've got some pretty sandy soil out here, but not too far below that is a clay layer of what I've been told is manganese, and it basically creates a layer where the roots can't penetrate through. And this will, if you dig your hole down and too deep and it sinks below the surface of the soil, you got problems. So dig it 3 times as wide, but no deeper than the tree needs to be, depending upon where it's going to end up below the soil. If you're planting avocados, you definitely want to plant it a little bit above that soil level, because you want it to be in a mound, and they don't like wet roots. And I can say the trees that we have out at the research station are, we try to mulch them as best we can. So make sure you mulch, make sure you leave a ring somewhere between 8 and 12 inches around the base of the tree, or else it's going to get dry crown root rot. And all of a sudden you find the tree falls over. I'm a teacher's assistant out here for a couple of the winemaking classes, which is very exciting. And the vineyard manager for Wilson Creek Winery came over the other day, and he was picking up some blueberry trees, blueberry bushes. I have to say blueberry trees because that's what my wife calls them. Blueberry bushes, and he was amazed at some of the big containers, in the 30 to 50 gallon or range that I have for some of my figs, and I'm using wine corks. I save my wine corks, and when I go to any gatherings that have wine enthusiasts, I save all those. And a couple of the wineries have had bags that have gotten contaminated, and so that makes a great mulch because they're big. I don't have to worry about them breaking down too quick, and more importantly, they don't get close enough to the ground level where the crown is to really create a problem. But if you're mulching, make sure you have that ring around there. There's a couple more questions. What sort of help are you looking for at the site? No, I know it's a far drive. Believe me, I'm 75 miles from everybody out here in Temecula, but for me, it's not that big of a deal. I've been to San Diego, and have talked to several of. I can't keep you guys straight. You have 2 chapters down there, and I can't keep them straight. But I've talked to, I think, both of them several times. But John, you can work, and certainly Bob, I know you're deep into CRFG, and make sure the folks get onto Tammy's mailing list. And when we are doing the pruning, that's the time. Isabel is also, once again, she's one of the coordinators there. And if some of you are willing to come up for that, certainly carpool it. It's not that bad of a drive. But when I was working for Xerox and Canon, I covered 5 counties. So for me, what's 75 miles? Not a big deal. 2 other messages. SD Weathers. Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Janice or Janice. There was a San Diego weather story. You guys are supposed to have the most temperate climate in the United States. And I had family that came out one time, and I had 2 cousins and my sister and 2 cousins, or 2 a niece and a nephew that came out, and they wanted to do the LA to Disneyland to Carmel to San Francisco to the Rock to the San Diego Zoo run in a week. And so the good uncle that I am, I said, sure. And I'm sitting there telling them, oh yeah, San Diego, it's going to be great. It's most temperate climate, yada, 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 yada. We get to San Francisco, we take the excursion to Alcatraz, and my nephew gets off and he says, where's the rides? And I go, Matthew, this is not an amusement park. It's an old prison. And he looked around, he goes, well, what am I going to do now? I said, I don't know. That's your problem. I'm here for a couple hours because I brought my 4x5. So because of the delays in getting to Alcatraz, when I first went there, you could get your tickets right away. Our trip was delayed, so I had to do the San Diego run directly from San Diego. And I'm telling them how nice it's going to be down there. We get in a hotel. We're going to the zoo the next day, and it was beautiful. The sun was out. It was blue sky. The wind picked up. The clouds came in. It started raining. Of course, the zoo didn't miss a beat. When it was cold and rainy, they had raincoats and hot chocolate. When it was sunny, they had lemonade. It started hailing. It turned to rain again. And then about an hour and a half later, it turned to blue skies. So much for the San Diego being the most temperate climate. It's just, I don't believe it. Any other questions? We are well into way more time than I thought we would be. I do want to share, and no other questions? Okay, let me do another quick screen share real quick. And I will show you what I'm going to be sending to Bob, or John, I'm sorry. And let me get back over here. Just this real quickly. Here is the documents, the wrong documents. That's the wrong share. Let me share the other one. And it's going to be this one. And all right. Too many screens open, I apologize.
While you're looking that up, there is another good source of information, which is specialty produce, which has a wonderful thing, just like our fruit facts. But Bob has a program where he does fruits from all over the world and does a dossier on them, which is very helpful and informative.
Okay, so that is part of the record, because we're still recording, could John, either you or Bob, could you go online, if it's your computer, go online real quick, find the link to that, and do a copy and paste that into the chat, and that way it'll be part of the record. The things I wanted to show you that I'm going to be sending to John is, and you should see that on your screen right now, it's the persimmons for the things from the calendar, which has the recipe. There's the presentation today. There's also kind of an interesting thing there we found in and this is where I thought I was going to find out about that green persimmon. There was a Department of Agricultural imports 1903 to 1905. And it talks about some of the persimmons that were imported back there. I included that as a PDF file. The 2-page Hoshigaki to dried persimmons. Persimmon Problem Solver, which is from some smart people. I don't remember who it's from. I believe it's from a university. And it will help you figure out by looking at the leaf characteristics, what is creating the problem. And then last but not least is the persimmon collection for what I call the primer. And that primer has a lot of basic information, and that is where your CRFG fruit fact sheet is in, plus a couple other things that I got from other people I'm just throwing in there. I'm a big PDF user. Now, the one on the presentation tonight, John, it may make your computer throw up on itself. It's 35 megabytes. So before I send you that one, I might do a trial run. And if it doesn't get to you, if it bounces back, I'll have to create a slightly lower resolution version that can get through the internet service provider. But I'll try to send you the big boy first. Okay. Let me stop sharing now. Any more questions that have come in? we still, okay, we lost a few, but we still have 18. I'm done. Let me turn control back over to you, John, and let me stop the recording.
Okay, well, appreciate it, Greg. That was really fun, very informative. Enjoyed it.